winner most recently of the Lionel Gelber Prize for your most recent book, Crashed, How a Decade of Financial Crises Changed the World. And of course, in Crashed, you expose how it was the petri dish, really, the financial crisis, for everything from Brexit to the Ukraine conflict to the election of Donald Trump. But the question is, we're here now, so what do we do? Jamie Dimon, Ray Dalio, they think they have some answers and that capitalism is failing us to a certain extent. Where around the world are you seeing something different that might work in the United States?
Well, I think the European societies, generally speaking, cope with inequality better. There's no doubt about that. They have the same underlying trends, what's called the pre-tax Gini. So the pre-tax element of inequality has increased there very considerably. But you don't see the post-tax increases in inequality that have been so dramatic in the United States since the 1970s. But that depends on the willingness to accept tax and spend, tax and redistribute public sectors, which bear very heavily on those societies. And even if they do achieve the effect of restoring degrees of income equality, don't necessarily generate the sense of social security that the welfare states of the 1950s and 60s used to generate.
Interestingly, you're just back from Germany, where you saw massive protests,
yes.
And obviously we know Germany is, or potentially is, in a recession. What were the protests about?
Yeah, Germany is the absolutely classic case of this. Very high employment right now, the inequality measured after tax much lower than in the United States, and still a pervasive sense of insecurity. And it's attached there, above all, to the issue of housing and the way in which rents have surged. Now, no one would ever compare the German housing market to Manhattan or the Bay Area or London or Paris, but nevertheless, the perceived sense of social risk and social insecurity is huge, as rents have doubled across the Berlin area. And that's what those protests were about, demanding public action, government action to stabilise the cost of living.
You've studied this, many decades of different orders. Capitalism clearly isn't working in its current form. What kind of incremental changes do you see out there, or proposals for incremental change, perhaps on the 2020 ticket, for example, do you see out there that might actually work?
I think we have to bite the bullet on this. The only formula we've ever had for addressing inequality has been tax and welfare. The other ways in which it's been historically addressed are incredibly unattractive. They're things like major wars and various types of inflation, and no one would advocate that as a way of addressing inequality. But tax works, and on the agenda of the 2020 election, on the left of the Democratic Party, you see proposals, and I think the one that is most serious is the one from Senator Warren for a graduated tax on wealth above 50 million, which, after all, is not going to affect anything but a very small minority of American societies, and is so modest it's not in any way going to affect incentives. It will be an administrative drag for sure. These people are going to have to do more elaborate tax returns, but it promises to really have a major redistributive effect, and I think that's really the bullet that has to be bit here if one wants to talk seriously about this problem.
Can change be incremental? Does it need to be incremental? I mean, what you're talking about is, yes, majorly just redistributive, but is it enough for 300 million people in the United States, or do we need something more revolutionary than that?
Well, there are obviously many demands out there right now for a much more fundamental change, and what we would be doing with a sort of Elizabeth Warren type proposal is a sticking plaster. There's no question about that. To address anything more fundamental would require wholesale change on, you might call, the supply side of social inequality, and it would have to go back to the issues which reformist progressive politics have struggled with for decades, which would start, for instance, with the public education system, would look at the multiply determined inequality and disadvantage that African Americans, especially African American men, suffer in American society today. It would have to address criminal justice as a key issue, which excludes tens of millions of people from not just the electorate, but from the formal labour market as well, because once you've got that criminal record, you have very little chance of getting in. It would have to be a truly holistic programme, and for that you need a political mobilisation like we saw in the New Deal. And that, I think, is really the question mark on the American horizon and the question mark on the American scene right now. Where is that genuine force of political change?
The idea of social democracy or democratic socialism that's sort of maybe lit a fire under the left, is it going to work in its current iteration? Is there something there?
Well, I think in particular parts of the United States, in this city here. It has a genuine constituency, especially amongst young people, amongst minority electorates in key boroughs of New York. There's no question at all that this kind of agenda, which to call it democratic socialism is to paint it in very bright colours. This is essentially just social democracy, welfare, reformism of the type that was pretty standard, even in the United States in the age of the New Deal. Pushing that agenda forward has to have a viable political constituency here. Will it work in Kentucky and Tennessee in the next couple of decades? Evidently not. But America is a huge place, and I think one has to think of this type of reformist politics as operating regionally, in the same way as the counterpart, the conservative movement, never imagined that it was going to score huge breakthroughs in this city or in California. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't fundamentally changed American society in its direction. So I think when progressives and radical progressives begin to think in those terms, they begin to get some traction.
One of the problems is political appetite for change, political will for change, and that also then goes back to the voter, and I guess it's always been a problem where voters vote against their own interests. That's the case in some countries in Europe at the moment too, without expressing an opinion. How do you get voters to align with their interests?
Well, I don't think there's any way around the old political problem, and it's a 19th century political problem, political education. You can't do this kind of politics simply on the basis of the focus group. And this is, again, something we have to learn from the Conservatives, if you like. They didn't imagine that everyone would buy into free market economics or their particular vision of America's future. It was a labour, persistent labour over decades of spreading that conservative message out through the MacArthur Centre, George Mason University, and so on and so forth. This is work that has to be done on the ground, and when progressive politics embraces that in the United States, I think there's no reason to think that tens of millions of people can't be won over for this kind of radical change. And given America's federal structure, that's what it really takes, right? You need to change key states in the Union to move this along. It isn't something that we can expect to come from what is, I think everyone agrees, a profoundly broken system at the centre.
I know that you're concentrating very strongly at the moment on sort of the parallel between US-China relations and negotiations and Europe-China negotiations. And the US and Europe are on very different pages here. What are your takeaways from the current state of affairs?
Well, I was really struck this morning, or maybe it was over the weekend, by protests that are coming in from the Trade Commissioner, Malmström, where she's saying, what are you guys doing, you Americans? Like, you appear to be negotiating like a managed trade deal, where you're going to agree with them, they'll take this much soy and that many chips. What era are we in? I mean, there's an extraordinary disconnect between the nuts and bolts pragmatism of the Lighthizer-Trump agenda on the American side, which is simply reduce the trade deficit, buy more of our stuff, or else, and the Europeans, who have a truly kind of orthodox doctrinaire view, which is that certain things are market economics, and talking about quotarized import quantities, which is what the Americans are forcing the Chinese to do. That belongs in an era which is really not of our present. It's a little bit analogous, if you like, to their much more hardline position on antitrust, both with regard to their own firms and with regard to big American tech firms. The Europeans actually have kind of drunk the market economics Kool-Aid and are forcing it down the Americans' throats at this point, and watching in kind of horrified disbelief as she and Trump try and bargain some deal out between the United States and Europe, at the same time as Europe's trying to do a deal with the Chinese because they have this rather embarrassing summit that they have to patch together this week.
And then I do have to ask you one question about Britain and where Britain stands in all of this, because it seems like Britain is turning itself around, folding its arms and saying, well, we're going to go our own way, and yet even that is not working for them. What's your base case on Brexit?
Well, it's the opposite of what was promised. I mean, if the promise of Brexit, the basic promise was take back control, look where they've ended up. They're waiting this week to hear whether the French president decides to pull a de Gaulle. That's where Brexit has left us, is whether or not Macron will veto. If Macron vetoes the extension, I think we're out by the 10th, right? And we are out of time. And there's no proposal on the British side to counter that. So, I mean, I think it's really a tragedy in that sense. If that was a legitimate aspiration to sovereignty, in some sense it was held out as a promise. We've ended up with the total